Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia. By now you've got an idea of the character of some of the convicts that came to Australia. We do, however, come across some of the youngest convicts and some of the oldest convicts as well. This is the story of two women who were transported to Australia, one being Elizabeth Hayward, the youngest female convict, and Dorothy Handland, the oldest female convict. We'll start with Dorothy. There is a lot of controversy on the internet about the first suicide in Australia. Robert Hughes has a book that indicates that a Dorothy Handland committed suicide once arriving into Port Jackson. It is said that she hung herself on a gum tree. However, there is also records of the ship Kitty that says that Dorothy Handland boarded and went back to England in 1793. Dorothy's story begins. Dorothy Cooley had married Robert Gray in 1766. In February 1777, Robert and Dorothy, who had an old clothing shop in Saffron Hill, were at the Old Bailey for the trial of Sarah Tongue, who was convicted of stealing various items from them. They found Sarah guilty and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. Although we find another 12 years later, 1786, Dorothy is in trouble at the Old Bailey herself. Her husband Robert Gray now passed away, and she has been married to another man, John Handland, who she is now separated from. It seems Dotty may be a bit dotty, as she is now accusing a William Till, who is working for the man that Dorothy is currently lodging with, a William Beach. Dorothy did not think much of William Till and accused him of stealing 3 line gowns, a silk gown, 3 pairs of sheets, a silk cloak, 14 linen handkerchiefs, all being the property of Dorothy Handland. During the trial there was a witness, Elizabeth Cohen, called in to give evidence. She had said that Dorothy had paid her 2 guineas to lie to the judge and say that William Till had come running out holding Dorothy's items. Now, Elizabeth Cohen had been an acquaintance of Dorothy for 16 years, but she wasn't about to lie in court and admitted that she did not know. Following this further damaging evidence, Dorothy Handland was found guilty. She was sentenced to 7 years transportation to Australia for wilful and corrupt perjury. She travelled to Botany Bay aboard the Lady Penrhyn, and although her age was listed at Newgate Prison as 61 years old, Archibald Smith, the acting surgeon on board the Lady Penrhyn, kept a diary that detailed the ages of convicts and a couple of drawings of them. He had her age at 82. On arrival, she virtually went unnoticed. As being an older convict, she wasn't interesting as far as the men were concerned. Being an older woman, they had more interest in the younger ladies. It has been noted that she attempted suicide by hanging herself on a gum tree. This is quite close to an entry written by George Barrington, who was a superintendent to the convicts. He briefly mentioned April of 1788. The winter was approaching and they quickly built huts for the women convicts. A woman convict was accused of stealing an iron, which was found in her possession. Being left alone, she hung herself, but was discovered and cut down in time to save her life. George went on to say that Governor Phillip, unhappy with the thefts, advised from then on any convict caught stealing was punishable by death, hanging. Could George have been talking about Dorothy? A hanging attempt at suicide, but saved. During the time that Dorothy was in Sydney, was living with 2 elderly convicts in a house under a rock where is now Millers Point area. The 2 men, Joseph Owens and Henry Barnett. It is understood that Joseph Owens was the oldest male convict in the First Fleet. Joseph Owens died in 1790, but Henry Barnett also took the Kitty home in 1793. David Collins, the judge advocate, lists her as boarding. He has noted invalids, 5 men and 1 woman, who their terms had expired, were permitted to return to their friends. At the time of departure, Dorothy was upward of over 80 years of age and had no concerns about weathering Cape Horn, wrote Collins. Kitty departed in 1793 and arrived at Cork on 5th of February 1794. It has been also noted on the English end the Navy Board had put her down the old woman from Botany Bay. Dorothy Handland was said to be one of the toughest women on the First Fleet. It is also funny that we hear of an old English children's game and it's named The Old Woman from Botany Bay, which is the same as how the Navy Board had recorded her when she disembarked from the ship the Kitty. The children's game begins with someone pretending to be Dorothy, dressed up with a basket, and there's a circle of children. She enters the circle and walks around, stopping in front of one of the children randomly and holding her basket out. And the object of the game is that the kids that are sitting down give her something for her basket. If the children didn't have anything to place in the basket, it is understood that the child playing Dorothy would chase them around until they got caught. The song goes, "Here comes the old woman from Botany Bay. What have you got to give her today?" Usually it was a hair tie or some coins, anything that they had in their pockets really. It is very interesting how the name stuck, the old woman from Botany Bay, and it is undoubtedly recorded that that was Dorothy. Elizabeth Hayward, the youngest female convict in the First Fleet. Born approximately 11th of December 1773 to parents Edward and Anne Hayward. Edward, her father, was a cooper, someone who makes barrels, buckets, tubs and troughs and other containers from wood. They lived near Rope Walk in Stepney, which was near to the industrial area where the rope works or rope makers for ships had their businesses, which was big business at the time. There are a few different accounts for Elizabeth. It has been recorded that her parents died when she and her younger brother Edward were young. Elizabeth and brother Edward were orphaned. I couldn't seem to find what had happened to the parents, but it has been noted that they both died. After the parents' death, Elizabeth and her brother Edward were separated. We find in 1786, Elizabeth is a clog maker's apprentice to a Thomas Cross. In the December of 1786, she was accused of stealing a gown, bonnet and bath cloak from her employer, which she apparently pawned, but there was no evidence or proof of this. They end up finding money in her living areas, which she claims she had saved for a long time in order to get back to her brother. Sadly for orphan Lizzie, she was not believed and ended up at Newgate Prison, awaiting transportation for 7 years' term. Newgate Prison was an awful London prison that housed many of the convicts before they were transported. Commissioned in the 12th century by King Henry II, it remained in use until 1902. It was located at the corner of Newgate and Old Bailey Streets, just inside the City of London. It had many courtrooms attached that was known at the time as the Old Bailey. The present-day Old Bailey actually sits on the area of the old Newgate Prison, which was demolished. In the late 1700s, they executed people on the outside wall of the prison. This stopped in 1865 when they resumed executing by hanging inside the jail. It was once shut down in 1419 as it was in dire need of repair. 22 people had died leading up to this in very cramped conditions. The women also had no toilets in their section and had to walk through the men's section to get to the lavatories. It had been renovated by 1422 and in the 15th century could hold 300 prisoners. The prison burnt down in 1666, the Great Fire of London. It was rebuilt in 1672 in a different design. It was then enlarged again in 1770, given a more horrific style, hoping to deter lawbreakers from committing crimes. Before it was completed in 1780, an angry mob stormed the prison and burnt it down, again by the Gordons' riot. By 1782 it was repaired once again, and this was about the time that our convicts started being loaded into the prison. When it outgrew the prisoners, they were forced to be stored in the hulks. We find that many of our female convicts were actually put into the Newgate Prison before they were transported. Moll Flanders, a book by Daniel Defoe published in 1722, has said this about Newgate Prison in his book. "'Tis impossible to describe the terror of my mind when I was first brought in, and when I looked around upon all the horrors of that dismal place. The hellish noise, the roaring, the swearing, and the clamour, the stench and the nastiness, joined together to make the place seem an emblem of hell itself and a kind of entrance to it." Overall, it was said that Newgate Prison was one of the worst places to be in London. You wouldn't want to be caught serving any time there. And hearing the hangings outside and then inside, it would have been a relief, in a sense, to be put onto these ships and sent to a faraway place rather than living the hell of Newgate Prison. It would have been even worse for young Lizzie. She was only 13 when they popped her into Newgate Prison, cramped in an awful place with other women, and often it has been said that some of these prisoners were barely clothed. It must have been a terrifying place for a 13-year-old child. Thankfully, it wasn't long. Lizzie was one of the many female convicts to board Lady Penrhyn in the First Fleet, bound for Botany Bay. Lizzie became the youngest female convict in the First Fleet. It wasn't until they arrived into Botany Bay that she turned 14. On arrival, being at that tender age, Lizzie was allocated to Reverend Richard Johnson's wife, Mary Johnson, to assist in their household as a servant. She's recorded as being there for a year, before on the 9th of February 1789 she receives 30 lashes for insolence. Insolence is rude or disrespectful behaviour, and it might have been that Mary just took something the wrong way, or it could have been the way Lizzie was. She may have been a bit rough around the edges. Either way, she was then transported on the HMS Sirius off to Norfolk Island. The Sirius left Port Jackson, however, on midday of 19th of March 1790, she struck the reef. Jacob Nagle was 25 years old. He was an able seaman who travelled to Australia on board the HMS Sirius as a member of the ship's crew. Who was on board at the time gives an account of what happened that day. He had started out his day fishing off the side of the Sirius before hearing that awful noise of the crunching of the reef crashing inside the hull of the Sirius. Before he knew where he was, the water was coming in really deep. The crew started packing things into chests and lowering them over the side, hoping that they would float, but a lot sank or was taken further out to sea. An anchor was immediately let go on her first striking, and in less than 10 minutes, every mast was over her side and the ship an entire wreck. Jacob Nagle was to swim to shore to carry a message to advise Captain Hunter and Major Ross of the circumstances. He got in and was swimming with all his might. The current was taking him further west than he wanted to be, and he had a bottle with the message in it so it wouldn't get wet. While Jacob was being carried west by the current, they sent a ship out to rescue him, but this overturned. Another boat was sent out to rescue him and managed to get him on board and safely back to the shore to advise Captain Hunter. On giving the letter to Captain Hunter, he appeared to be much surprised and said he never saw a man swim with so much power and strength as Jacob had just done. Jacob had known about the dangers, but had a good reason for it. Many of the crew members were throwing things loosely off the ship in the hope that it may float ashore. Some things did float to shore and they were able to gather them safely. This must have been another traumatic time for Lizzie. The Sirius crashing on the reef and everybody having to get overboard and start swimming for shore, awaiting rescue. It seems she's gone from one traumatic event to another. This not only upset the people that were on the ship, scampering to safety, but the people on Norfolk Island who were waiting on the Sirius to go back to Port Jackson. But now that it was wrecked, how could they get back? It wasn't until the 4th of February 1791 that they sent the HMS Supply to come to Norfolk, picking up people who needed to go back to Sydney. Now serving her term on Norfolk Island, there were other convicts being sent to Norfolk Island all the time. The Second Fleet came through, and it is noted a convict by the name of William Nichols, who was a carpenter aboard the Royal Admiral in May 1792. It seems William and Lizzie must have stirred up a relationship, as on 2nd of March 1794 it has been noted that Elizabeth had a baby girl, and William was the father. William and Lizzie were about the same age now, around about the 21-year-old mark. They have another child in 1795, but the records are lost. It may be that that child died shortly after birth. In 1796, they have another child together, Margaret. From here things get a little strange, as William is no longer recorded as being alive. There is no mention of him again. Elizabeth remains on Norfolk Island. She has a son, George, born in 1802, and in later years, George has the surname Collins. There was a George Collins who came to Norfolk Island in 1801, but then is also recorded as dying in 1803. Poor Lizzie, she hasn't had much luck at all so far. In 1810, records for Norfolk Island show Elizabeth, now a free woman, having completed her sentence, and her eldest daughter, Elizabeth Nichols, being 16 as a free woman. They own 10 sheep and 1 cow, and have now settled on Norfolk Island together with younger daughter Margaret Nichols and son George Collins. Eldest daughter Elizabeth Nichols is the mistress of Captain Piper, and in 1812 she was the only woman recorded as owning stock: 525 sheep, 4 cattle, 15 swine and 40 goats. It sounds as though she's got quite a farm happening there. Elizabeth Nichols bears a son to Captain Piper, and they give him the name Norfolk. It is known that Captain Piper was the commander at Norfolk Island from September 1804 to April 1810, and this was apparently the happiest time at the island. Captain John Piper had the suburb Point Piper in Sydney named after him. It seems that eldest daughter Elizabeth Nichols wasn't the only mistress of Captain Piper. Through my research, I found that there was other children to other mistresses before he settles down with Mary Ann Shears. We hear in 1805, Elizabeth Hayward lives with a Joseph Lowe, who is also referred to as James. Joseph Lowe arrived in Australia on the Matilda in the 3rd Fleet. He was a member of boat crew and also as a tailor. Joseph Lowe received a free pardon on the 17th of September 1810. In 1811, Governor Macquarie toured Van Diemen's Land, and this was going to be the settlement for people to move from Norfolk Island. He found a nice little place south of Port Dalrymple to relocate them. The final relocation took place in 1813. One of the ships, Lady Nelson, departed on the 20th of January with 45 people on board, destined for Port Dalrymple. Among these passengers on the Lady Nelson was Elizabeth Hayward and Joseph Lowe, with 2 children, Margaret Hayward Lowe, 17 years, and George Hayward Lowe, 11 years. The final ship, Minstrel, departed from Norfolk Island on the 18th of February 1813, also destined for Port Dalrymple. This had 63 people on board, including daughter Elizabeth Nichols and her child Norfolk Nichols Piper, 3 years old. Elizabeth Nichols was compensated £16 for the price of her dwelling on Norfolk Island that she had to leave behind. Port Dalrymple is located on the top of Tasmania, east of Devonport. Van Diemen's Land, later known as Tasmania, named after Abel Tasman. Norfolk Plains was named after the Norfolk Islanders expelled from their island in 1813 and resettled in the top part of Tasmania. The area comprised of different towns and rural properties around Longford, Cressy, Bishopbourne, Illawarra and Perth. 2013 marked the 200 years the Norfolk Islanders settled in the plains. It was recorded in 1813 that Joseph Lowe and Elizabeth Hayward received 40 acres at Norfolk Plains. They did very well for themselves. On the Landholders' Muster 1820, they have 40 acres together with horses, cattle and sheep. In 1816, Joseph Lowe was supplying government stores with 1,100 pounds of fresh meat. In 1814, he had acquired a small allotment in Wellington Street, Launceston, but after the death of Elizabeth in 1836, he sold this off. Elizabeth Hayward Lowe was buried on the 29th of October 1836 in the Church of England Cemetery in Cypress Street, Launceston, although the cemetery was converted into a sporting ground in 1953. It is also said that she was one of the oldest living convicts from the First Fleet, dying at age 72. In 1819, Elizabeth Nichols becomes the wife of a David Gibson, and they are living at Pleasant Banks at Evandale. They rear 10 Gibson children, and she lives to the age of 77, being buried in the church grounds in Evandale in 1872. It is understood the other 2 children would have lived their lives in Launceston area as well. In Evandale, the house, Pleasant Banks, where Elizabeth Nichols and David Gibson once lived, still stands today. It does make me quite happy that although Lizzie had quite a traumatic start to her little life, she did end up happy and abundant in most aspects of her life. These are just some of the stories, and there are so many stories about the convicts in the First Fleet. Stay tuned for another episode where we delve into the youngest male convict, John Hudson, the missing cows and bulls of the First Fleet, the first cannibal in Australia, and the disappearing man, William Buckley. Please remember to like, subscribe and share, and hit that notification bell so you're fully aware when we release our next episodes.